In my teaching studio, all my students realize that once they're there for a little while, then I stress what I call the 4 pillars of practice. So if you're in my teaching studio, if you're one of my students, we're working on 4 things. We work on technique, we work on musicality, we work on repertoire, and then once you've got a little bit of this under your hands, we work on practice away from the drums, otherwise known as like deep listening or analytical listening. Overall, the foundational element of those 4 that you really gotta have, you gotta have some of this under your hands, no pun intended, before some of the others can happen, is technique. So in other words, if you don't have a little bit of technique in your hands and in your feet, it's gonna be hard for you to be able to play musically. It's gonna be hard for you to be able to work on repertoire. And it's virtually impossible for you to practice away from the instrument, because if you don't have some technique in your hands to be able to play some things, how are you going to be able to carry that out from what you're hearing in your head? So my masterclass is going to focus on technique, and it's in particular going to focus on working your hands. Now, I mentioned earlier, I love questions when everybody asks questions. I'm going to tell you how much I love questions. I'm going to ask you all a question. What are some great things to do as a drummer to work your hands? If some people on this front row don't answer this. Rudiments. That's a good one. What else? Songs. Spoken like a guitar player. Yes, we're going to have fun in here today. Let's go with rudiments for a second, okay? Let's go with rudiments. Okay, rudiments are what we would call like the foundational building blocks for working on our hands, right? And in particular, whenever you work on rudiments, there are already, I'm sure there's connotations in everyone's mind as far as like, well, there are certain aspects of rudiments that I either don't like or are very challenging. Now here's part 2 of this question. What are some of the inherent challenges of working on rudiments? You know what I like to say? The tedium. I like to say sometimes the straight up like boredom or the dryness of it. That's a good one. That's a very good one. What else? Consistency. How about this also? There's a whole lot of them. Right? There's a whole lot of them. So essentially what ends up happening when you have that kind of trifecta of these different types of problems you have, as far as like, well, they can be sometimes tedious, maybe even a little bit boring or dry when you're working on them by themselves. There's a whole lot of them. So a lot of times rudiments when we're working on our hands, they get the short shrift a little bit, right? In other words, I know that everybody's like, yeah, I work on my rudiments. I work on this stuff all the time. Well, I'm going to show you some different ways to work on these. And so for those of you who play video games, you're going to appreciate the name of my masterclass. Rudimental cheat codes. Yeah. Now, additionally, the one thing that I want to stress about this is one of the things that sometimes also gets glossed over is when you are working on rudiments, you need to be able to play them very organically, and you need to be able to play them in musically appropriate places, okay? I don't call rudiments drum set vocabulary, okay? Now, I know some people do, and that's fine. I call them improvisational vocabulary. You need to have these rudiments down so well that they just find their way into your playing, okay? In other words, think of it like this for a second, all right? It sounds ludicrous when I say this, but if you're up there, you know, you're playing a drum groove and you're getting ready to play a drum fill, I certainly hope you're not sitting there thinking, okay, I'm gonna play this face melter of a drum fill that includes paradiddle number 2. You know, like drag paradiddle number 2. Okay, here comes pat-a-fla-fla around the toms. No, that's not the way you want to use these type of things, right? And I also want to couch this by saying, okay? There are certain rudiments, or as a matter of fact, let's just go ahead and say all rudiments, okay, they were created and used well before we actually put all of these instruments together and made a drum set. In other words, they were originally meant to be played on snare drum, field drum, right, as rudimental drummers, military drummers. So quite honestly, there are some rudiments that don't necessarily fit on drum set, okay? But what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the ones that do, okay, and the ones that are very practical for your usage, and ones that you should be able to organically place inside of your playing, okay? Let's talk about a few other reasons why you need to learn rudiments. We're not going to spend too much time on this, okay? The first one, okay, they're the fundamental rhythmic building blocks, right? I want you to think about this, and notice that I put down where it says of the percussion discipline. I want you to think about this. If you're a timpanist, if you play mallet keyboards, and to some extent, if you're playing accessories, there's a whole lot of technique that we learn on this instrument, on our foundational instruments, that's directly applicable to those. So rudiments are going to help you in every aspect of what you do as a percussionist, and not just a snare drummer or a drum set player. Secondly, individual rudiment study allows you to work on your technique with undivided attention. Think about this. If you're working on snare drum, you're working on one surface. One surface, you're not reading anything. You can look at your hands. You can really work on your technique that way, okay? Now, notice I put a little bullet point under that says, inadequate technique is the primary reasons that drummers seek instruction. I cannot tell you how many times I have a very advanced drummer or another professional call me up and they go, invariably, I'll always say, why are you contacting me? What do you need me for? It's normally always one of two things. They'll say, man, I feel like my playing's hit the wall. Or secondly, it'd be something like this. It'll be like, you know, when I'm playing gigs, I'm hearing all these wonderful musical ideas, but I don't feel that I can execute them. 99.9% of the time, it's a lack of technique. It's a technical deficiency, and it blows their mind when I sit down and I'll go, play me singles, play me doubles, play me paradiddles, and they're not very good. So technique, incredibly important, and it is something, like I said, that almost everybody who has problems, that's one of the things that they seek out instruction to basically help with that. Also, rudiments connect you with the history of drumming. Now, if you're a drum nerd like me, there's something really special about that. I want you to think about this for a minute. When you're sitting down working on flams, drags, paradiddles, singles, doubles, Buddy Rich did that. Philly Joe Jones did that. Tony Williams did that. Billy Cobham did that. You just name it, on and on and on. There's something really cool about that. You're working on something that some of the masters, John Robinson's working on that back there right now. Very cool. Mastery allows your musical mind to play improvisationally, and that's one of the big things we want to talk about, okay? We want to use these type of rudiments, and we want to use this type of playing improvisationally. We don't want to force this stuff, right? It's kind of like when you're having a conversation with somebody and you're using just normal language, and then somebody throws in $100 word, you know? And the sarcophagus of the blah. What? You know? That's the way it sounds if you're a drummer and you're playing along, then all of a sudden you rip inverted flam taps around the drum set when you're trying to play just a basic like eighth note fill, okay? It builds independence as well, okay? Now, in particular, what we're talking about is two-way independence right now. In other words, just working with your hands. And I want you to think about it from this standpoint for a second. Of course, when we talk about independence, we're talking about just rights and lefts, but take, for example, just like a paradiddle for a second. Just a single paradiddle. Notice that aside from getting your hands separated and playing the right stickings, notice that there's a little bit of choreography with stick heights. Right? So that helps you build independence from the standpoint of also working on stick heights, snapping your wrist, dropping the strokes, using your fingers. So it builds some modicum of independence as well. And if you're someone who counts whenever you play, it's basically also building three-way independence, right? Get your voice going at the same time as well. So you can go all up to three-way. And then if you're like Terry Bozzio or some of the guys who play double bass drum, they play rudiments with their feet too, okay? All right, and then your proficiency on drum set is directly connected to the proficiency on the snare drum. Otherwise known, what I tell all my students, you're only as good of a drum set player as you are a snare drummer. Okay? Now, what I want to qualify that, because everybody goes, well, what about Phil Rudd from AC/DC, right? I mean, just playing, great drummer, unbelievable drummer. Probably couldn't play a Radimacue if you put a rifle to his head, right? But all I'm saying is this, okay? If you can't execute a rhythm on one surface, you are not going to be able to execute that rhythm on multiple surfaces. Doesn't mean you can't play drum set, okay? I'm just saying if you're given a rhythm, if you're given a rudiment, if you're given something to play, and if you can't play it on this one surface, you're not going to be able to do it on multiple, okay? Now, let's talk about the rudiments that I want to talk about, all right? Now, up there on the screen, everybody has access to this if you want it, okay? This is just the PAS International Rudiment. There are 40 of them. You can get them for free on the PAS.org. So the rudiments that we're going to talk about today, they're going to be based on these 40, okay? Now, I know some of y'all are probably, marching drummers, marching band. Some of you may even be interested in drum corps. You got all kinds of hybrid rudiments and stuff like that. That's fantastic, but that's not what I'm going to base my masterclass on today. It's going to be based on the 40, okay? Now, to make learning these easier, which ultimately means make playing them in musically appropriate situations easier, I want to show you a variety of ways to group them. For our teachers, we like to call it chunking, right? Putting all this material together in big chunks that makes it a little bit easier to memorize and learn. And then I want to also give you a whole bunch of mental reframes, because there are certain times that you can teach somebody something or you're learning something and you're just playing it as it is, but if you can just flip a switch and think about something slightly differently, many times it will unlock the key, or the key will unlock the lock, and you can then reframe it and play it significantly simpler. So ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to memorize these, how to learn these much quicker through different reframes and different ways of grouping. Now, the first thing, if we have any mafia buffs in here, we're going to talk about the 5 families. Hey, okay? Yeah. So there are 5 major groups and an outlier, okay? Now, first thing, there's 40 rudiments, right? So let's group 39 of them into 5 groups, and then we'll have our outlier, okay? So the first one, we got our single stroke rudiments. Those are the ones like single stroke 4, single stroke 7. Then we have the roll rudiments, and notice I put just a little asterisk there, okay? These are rolls that are going to be interpreted with a single stroke articulation. Double stroke roll, 5-stroke roll, 7-stroke roll, 9-stroke roll, 6-stroke roll, so on and so on, right? We're not going to close those up. We're going to keep them open, okay? Then we have the paradiddle rudiments. Single paradiddle, double paradiddle, triple paradiddle, paradiddle diddle. Then we have the flam rudiments, right? The flam rudiments, which also include, I put a little asterisk on there as well. Inside of the flam rudiments, you also have single strokes, double strokes, and paradiddle rudiments grouped inside of that. Then you have the drag rudiments. Drag rudiments also include the single stroke and paradiddle rudiments that are inside of those, okay? So the reason I put those little asterisks in there is because I want you to be able to draw a straight line to be able to relate these to one another, okay? Too many times students look at these rudiments and they look as, this is a flam accent, and that is it by itself. This is a flam paradiddle, and this is what it is, and it has no relation to anything else. And I want you to realize that there's a lot of relationship between these two. It's going to make it significantly easier for you to learn, okay? And then the outlier, the multiple bounce roll, otherwise known as the concert roll, the closed roll, the buzz roll, okay? All right, we're going to get to that one in a little bit too. Now, here we go for Professor Smith's proprietary language, All right. Synonym rudiments. A lot of people don't realize that there are 6 pairs of rudiments that are identical in sound but have different stickings. Quick math will tell you 6 pairs, that's 12 rudiments. There are 40 that we're talking about. So if you have those 6 pairs down, you already have a little over 25% of your rudiments. So the most graphic one is the single stroke roll and the double stroke roll. All right? What I tell students all the time is if you're doing a single stroke roll or a double stroke roll and you have your back to me, I shouldn't be able to tell if you're playing singles or doubles, right? You should be able to alternate between those two. Those are synonym rudiments. They sound identical but have different stickings. Let's look at some others, and I'll show you a few more. So what I did was I just grouped these together in 6 pairs. The first one up there, you see the double stroke roll and a single stroke roll. Look at the one down on the bottom left. Double paradiddle and paradiddle diddle. Exact same rhythm, different sticking, right? Your double paradiddle has 2 sets of singles and a double. The paradiddle diddle has a set of singles and 2 doubles. Alternate between the two, should hear very little difference in sound. Okay, let's look at the second column. Flam accent, Swiss triplet. Okay, Swiss triplet is just what we'd call side triplets. There's a little bit of nomenclature for you. Side triplets just mean there's going to be 2 notes on one hand and 1 on the other, starting with a flam, an accented flam, and then flam accents are just alternating triplets with a flam at the beginning. So flam accents, Swiss triplets, accent, triplet. Okay, synonym rudiment. And then let's look at the last one down there. We got flam tap and inverted flam tap. Okay? Notice that with the flam tap, I like to call that, we'll talk about this reframe in a few minutes. Flam taps are very much like what I'd call double strokes with a flam at the beginning of each set of doubles. And I like to think of flam taps as actually a flam accent missing the last note. So if you're good, in other words, if you're really good at your flam accents, that in itself can help you reframe and think about how to play inverted flam taps, right? So flam taps, flam accent, or excuse me, inverted flam tap. Flam tap, inverted tap. Okay? Synonym rudiments, right? So if you got those 12 down, you already got a quarter of your rudiments. This one flummoxes the world. Whether or not you alternate a rudiment or where you have to do 2 separate sets. I have just a general rule of thumb that works 99% of the time. If your rudiment starts and ends on the same hand, it alternates. If it starts on one hand but ends on the opposite hand, you have to do 2 separate sets. It won't alternate, okay? So your example that I've got up there, we'll do the stroke rolls. We'll do a 5-stroke roll and then a 7-stroke roll. A 5-stroke roll begins on the right hand and ends on the right hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that means you can automatically come right back and alternate with the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A 7-stroke roll would begin on your left and then end on your right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So therefore, it doesn't make any sense to come right back and start alternating on your right hand. You just do a full set on your left hand. Here's your 5s that alternate. Sevens begin on the left hand, end on the right hand, do not alternate. You have to do a whole separate set starting on your right and ending on your left. And again, you can take that knowledge with you to all of these rudiments. If it begins and ends on the same hand, it'll alternate. If it begins on one hand and ends on the other, you have to do 2 separate sets, okay? Let's keep going. And again, if you have, let's see. Is that moving? There we go. If you have questions about this stuff, if you're unsure, please ask questions. The next one, accents. A lot of times, I'll have students, I'll come in and I'll say, play me a rudiments or play me whatever. And then all of a sudden they'll play it, or even a paradiddle. And then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, what about the accent? Huh? What? Or better yet, they'll play it a different way. I've got a quick story I'll tell you about this. I used to teach at a small college in Alabama. And invariably, and I used to do it just for a kick to see what would happen. I would ask these students who would come out and say, play me a single rudiments. Okay, teachers and students, I'm not going to say it's wrong, but let's just say, what is different about what I'm going to play regarding how it's actually interpreted in a traditional way? So I'd say, hey, guy, play me a single rudiments. They'd go. Anybody notice what's different?
The accent's not on the last note.
Yeah. On a rudiments, the traditional interpretation would have you play it like this. And so I would say, hey, did you know that the traditional interpretation of that has the accent on the last note? And it's like, no, I had no idea, okay? So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about how you can also learn where these accents go so you don't have these questions, because there are some very logical ways to remember this as well. On double stroke rudiments, like for example, let's say you're doing 5s, 7s, 9s, even the even ones as well, like 6s and 10s. On the odd numbered one, the odd numbered finishing stroke, like for example, the single stroke that's at the end of a 5-stroke roll, there's where your accent's traditionally played. Same thing for your 7-stroke roll, same thing for the 9-stroke roll. It's the finishing stroke, the odd number traditionally gets the accent. On paradiddle rudiments, the accents are normally played on the first note. Single paradiddle, it's on the first note. Double paradiddle, first note. Triple paradiddle, first note. Paradiddle diddle, first note. Some old school interpretations of those paradiddles, especially the doubles and triples, will put them on each set of singles. But the more accepted way now, if you were in an audition and somebody goes, hey, play me a triple paradiddle, you're not going to go wrong by just playing the accent on the first note. Okay? On flam rudiments, the accents are traditionally placed on the flam, with the notable exception of the flamacue. That's a good way to remember your flamacue, right? Is that's the only one of our traditional flam rudiments where the accent doesn't fall on the flam. Flam accents, flam paradiddles, flammed mills, flam paradiddle diddle, flam drag, inverted flam taps, all of those have the accent on the flam. Flamacue, non-accented flam, accent on the second note on the E. On drag rudiments, drag rudiment accents are traditionally played anywhere else but on the drag. Okay? So, in particular, if you got a good visual mind, think about that second page of the rudiments, right, where you got all the flams on one column and you got the drags on the other. On the flam side, on that left side, all those accents are on the flams except the flamacue. When you go to the drag rudiments on the right side of the page, all of your accents are everywhere except the drag, with the notable exception of the single dragadiddle. Okay? Told you there's going to be a lot of stuff. I'm just going to shoot it at you like crazy. You're getting a year of private lessons in an hour. Accent dynamics, okay? In traditional rudimental drumming, there are 2 primary dynamic levels. And this is, let me go ahead and clarify that by saying, if you're looking at a traditional rudimental solo, if there's no dynamic level noted, the traditional interpretation would have you play non-accented notes forte, accents double forte. Think about that for a minute. Does anybody want to throw out a reason of why you think it's loud and louder? How did you know that? Right, yeah. In other words, traditional rudimental drumming was always meant to be played outdoors. And on top of that, if you think back, way back, we didn't have these wonderful plastic drum heads that we have now. We had calfskin heads or some type of animal skin head. And any of you who've ever dealt with those unruly beasts know that they are the bane of your existence anytime you have any modicum of weather change, right? That's why also, by the way, you know, if you look at a lot of Remo heads, it'll say Weather King on there. Think about that for a minute, right? In other words, they're really not affected very much by weather. Whereas if you have a calfskin head on a snare drum, and especially if you lived in Atlanta like I did for 28 years, you would take that thing and you would throw it as far as you possibly could after you paid $125 for that calfskin head. Because with the amount of moisture that's in the air out there, you would literally have to put 3 empty flesh hoops on the drum first, and then put the calfskin head on and crank it down as tight as you can, then put a fan on top of it, and so on to blow the moisture out, okay? But ultimately where I'm going with this, okay, is to be able to get those calfskin heads to move, you had to play them. You had to get into those things, right? So you had to play them hard, and then secondarily, the last thing is that for these military drummers, it could literally be life and death if you didn't articulate your cadence well. Does everybody understand what I'm saying about that? They used to communicate. We didn't have walkie-talkies and internets, you know, back in the 1700s or the 1800s. And so what ended up happening was the communication on those drums would go from one platoon to the next to the next. And if you didn't articulate that cadence correctly, there could be a big difference between all is well and charge. Seriously, right? Okay? Rhythms. Now, one of the things that you will see on your PAS rudiment sheet is that, of course, all of the rhythms are notated. But there's something that I tell all of my students is that, look, if you want to learn these, and if you want to get especially to the point to where if you want to just launch straight into them, be able to play them quickly and confidently, you can also attach a time signature to them, okay? So let me explain what I'm talking about here, okay? All right. So, for example, you can add a time signature to paradiddle rudiments to make them easier to play at a fast tempo. And what I mean by that is, for example, let's say you're at an audition, right? And you're getting ready to audition for the doctoral program at, I don't know, University of Texas, right? And your auditioner's going, all right, up-tempo, triple paradiddles. Well, if you don't know them super, super well, there is one way that you can actually know that you're playing it correctly. Put a time signature to it. 4/4 works really well. So let me give you an example. So this is your triple paradiddle. But if you had to play it just launch right into it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. 3/4 works really good for double paradiddles and paradiddle diddles, like paradiddle diddle. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Same thing for double paradiddles. And then I also mentioned, not that you would necessarily need it, but you could just think of single paradiddles in 2/4. I've got down here also, you could do drag paradiddle number 1 in 3/4, drag paradiddle number 2 in 4/4. Okay? So again, thinking about putting a time signature with some of the more extended rudiments can help you learn them, okay? Few more rhythms here, right? Few more rudiments. Oh, wait a minute, that's the same one. Hang on. Here we go. A few more. Double rudiments can be played in 3/4. Triple rudiments can be in 4/4. Single drag taps can be in 2. Double drag taps can be in 3/4. So, for example, we'll just take those last two. Single drag tap. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Double drag tap. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Rhythmic ending points. For metered rolls, most drummers have no idea how to end them. Or, they just kind of look at them and they kind of go, oh, I think a 15-stroke roll will fit in there. Oh, wait a minute, I think a 12-stroke, no, what? A 12-stroke roll? No, I think a 11-stroke roll will fit in there, maybe. Well, how do you know for sure? Well, you need to know where they begin and where they end. Like, especially, and by the way, I'm going to talk about these from the binary standpoint, not the ternary standpoint. I'm going to talk about them phrased in 16ths and or 32nd notes, okay? So, for example, I want to go to these, okay? All right, so I have all of the odd-numbered strokes up there, 5s, 7s, 9s, 11s, 13s, 15s, and 17s. Again, if you had to play a really quick 17-stroke roll, instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and you just can't do it. You need to know how to meter those out and make sure that you can end on the 17th stroke. The 17th stroke, if you play them in a binary fashion, each double that you're going to play, right, right, left, left, will get 1/16th note count, which my mathematical friends will tell you, well, that's 32nd notes, correct, right? So for each double you play, you're going to count 1/16th note, and for a 17-stroke roll, you're going to end on count 3. That's a 17-stroke roll. 1 yen, a 2 yen, a 3 yen, a 4 yen, a 1 yen. If you had to play a 9-stroke roll, you can see up there, you can see it's a quarter note, which means that it's going to end on count 2. 1 yen, a 2, 1 yen, a 2. Now, how do you learn these? Aside from just practicing them. The way you learn them is this: start at the 5-stroke roll. 5-stroke roll, it's going to start on count 1, and with a binary interpretation, it's going to end on the and of 1, okay? 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 1 E and a, 2 E and. For every binary interpretation, as you increase one series of rolls, when you go from 5 to 7, the 5-stroke roll ends on the and of 1. The 7-stroke roll will get pushed over 1/16th to the of 1. The 9-stroke roll gets pushed 1 more 16th note over to count 2. The 11-stroke roll gets pushed over 1 more 16th note to the E of 2. So you see the pattern, right? Every time you add a double and it extends it to the next roll, next odd-numbered roll, it just ends the resolution point, or the finishing stroke ends 1/16th note further, okay? And we traditionally stop at 17 strokes, but you can go as far as you want to go. And also, let me go ahead and say this, okay? More information, more, that if you interpret these ternary as in triplets, the resolution points are different, okay? Come see me. I'll help you with that if you need that, okay? All right. Moving on. Now I want to show you some more of what I call Smith proprietary pedagogy, okay? Learning through reframes. Sometimes, like we talked about before, if you just think about something differently, and especially if you think about it differently and relate that thing to something you already play very well, there's your key, unlocks the door, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about a few of these rudiments and just think about them slightly differently, and all of a sudden, it might unlock your ability to play them better. Alternating flams reframe. When I lived in Atlanta, I used to play, I was one of the first call drummers to play on those Broadway bus and truck shows that would come through and play at the Fox Theater. And when they needed an orchestra, they would hire us and we would come in and play, and I would do the drum set part and some accessories and maybe a little bit of keyboard, and then my buddy, a guy named John Lawless, who's a professor at Kennesaw State University, he would play timpani, more keyboards, and some other things. And so we were getting ready to do one of these shows like Ragtime or Titanic or something like that. This was like 25 years ago. And John had a practice pad, and this was like 15 minutes before we started, and he was doing this. Just ripping flams. I mean, just tearing them apart. And I was like, what kind of wizardry are you doing over there, John Lawless? And he's this really funny, kind of affable guy. But he's one of those guys, he's kind of like the silent assassin. You know, he's one of those guys like, oh, I don't even know how I got here. And he's like one of the best living percussionists kind of guy, you know. And he goes, oh, man, those are just floppies. Have you all ever heard that term before, what they call floppies or floppy flams? So essentially all it is this. If you've got a good double stroke roll, you may not realize it, but you actually have really good flams. Okay, now just follow me here for a second, okay? What you want to do is when you're working on your double strokes, you know, your teacher always yelling at you, keep those stroke motions even, right? Make sure you articulate that second note of each double, make it sound just like the first note. Well, now you're going to throw all that away, okay? So what you do is essentially this, okay? You get your double stroke roll going, and then you're going to have, think about this for a second. Okay, here's 8 double strokes, kind of evenly put together. You're going to let one hand either drag or rush a little bit, and this is going to happen. They're basically going to end up creating flams. So let me show you. I'm just going to play a fast double stroke roll. Then I'm going to let one hand get just a little bit behind, and you'll hear it turn into flams. Okay? Still, I'm not even thinking flams. I'm just thinking of bad double strokes, right? And it turns into flams. So there's a little way to rip some fast flams if you need them. Okay? Flam tap reframe. Okay? I've already mentioned this one. I like to tell my students that are having trouble with this, think of them as a double stroke roll with a flam at the beginning of each one. Okay? So again, this is another one. There's a little bit of assumption that you've already got some, what we'd call it, basic technique. Like most teachers are going to start you out on singles and doubles and paradiddles, right? So if you have your doubles down, you can relate singles and doubles to some of these reframes. So I'll just tell students when you're working on flam taps, think of them as double stroke roll, put a flam at the beginning of each one. Remember, where do the accents fall on flam rudiments? On the flam, right? So double stroke, flam tap. Doubles. Flam taps. Now, there's another teacher of mine that will also tell you, now I don't particularly like this one, but he will also say that you can think of it as a triple stroke roll. Okay, 3 singles on each hand. I'm going to put one hand on this pad and one hand on the rim, and you'll hear what I'm talking. I'm going to do it slowly so you can hear that it's basically a triple stroke roll on each hand, okay? The only thing, aside from I'm not a huge fan of triple stroke rolls because I always kind of connotate them as like also what happens when you play like a fortissimo closed roll kind of turns into that sometimes. But the other thing I don't particularly like about it is it puts a lot of emphasis on the grace note from that standpoint. I kind of like to think of it as a double stroke roll, and then it kind of minimizes the importance of the grace note. Okay? Let's go on to the next one. Inverted flam taps. I mentioned this one already, okay? This one, if you've got a good flam accent, think of a flam accent, just the first 2 notes. Does that make sense? Think of just the first 2 notes of a flam accent, and that's inverted flam taps. I'll tell you, a lot of times, that's the one that really unlocks that lock for a lot of students, okay? So how do you practice these? And then we're going to talk about how to use them in a very organic musical fashion, okay? You're traditionally going to play those 5 families, open, closed, open. For those of you who are not familiar with that terminology, open, closed, open is going to mean slow to fast to slow. Our drumming forefathers were geniuses. And the reason is, if you're doing something open, closed, open, what it's doing is it's making you go through the full range of technique in your hands. Okay? Now, there's a lot of credence and currency into just going for a specific tempo. As a matter of fact, I've got up here, it says you can also practice like your standard American march tempo of 120, or you can just set a goal. Like, for example, I have all my, especially second-year students, you got to be able to play singles for about 30 seconds at 200 beats per minute as 16th notes. Just need to be able to do that. So work toward that, right? So working toward a single tempo is also good. It's also it's a very graphic way to kind of gauge your progress. Remember, if you are not measuring your progress, you're not managing your practice. So make sure you are measuring what you're doing. These little tempo goals are great ways to do it as well, okay? And then the other thing that every single one that I have my students work on is I have them work on what I call traditional rudimental literature. And in addition to like just working your hands, it adds musical context to the entire thing. Like, for example, I like the Wilcoxon book. I like the NARD book a lot. There's one that I put at the end, the Joe Tompkins book. That's a level above those, man. It's kind of like Joe Tompkins said, hey, I'm going to take Wilcoxon and I'm going to like put premium gas in it, right? Okay, so that's, and I know, Aiden, you're working on one of those right now with me, that Trios by Tompkins. So I like working out of those books because it puts musical context and phrasing that is directly translatable over to the drum set. You can take some of those Wilcoxon solos either out of the 150 or out of the modern rudimental swing solos. You can take those things and voice them on the drum set and you sound like Philly Joe Jones. I mean, they are direct. I mean, no questions asked. Wilcoxon wrote that 150 rudimental solos book in 6 months. And he wrote it to address a problem, which was back in the 1940s, most drummers were leaving playing just concert-style percussion because the drum set was far and away the preeminent percussion instrument at that time. But he knew that his students that he was teaching drum set to needed this foundational element in their playing. So what he did was he wrote those 150 solos to be able to be played and sound good on drum set, but yet the clever devil that he was snuck all those rudiments in, right? Work on your technique, work on your musical depth. The outlier, your buzz roll is traditionally practiced soft, loud, soft. Anybody want to guess why you don't play that one open, closed, open? Well, think of it like this. The multiple bounce roll, the press roll, the concert style roll, it's our version of a sustained note, right? Like, for example, if you were a brass player, trumpet player, and you heard somebody practicing long tones and they were going, bah! What's the tempo? Right? So when we do a multiple bounce roll, press roll, that's our version of that. So we work on it dynamically, soft, loud, soft. Now, here's the thing. You can meter those things out and work on them with different meterings, which you can do them. Open, closed, open. The traditional interpretation of the buzz roll is going to be soft, loud, soft. Okay? Now, let's put it all together. How do you use these things on drum set? Okay? Now, like I mentioned when I very first started, I don't call rudiments drum set vocabulary. It becomes forced a lot of times whenever you do that. I say you learn these things, and what ends up happening is you learn them so well that they just become organic parts of your playing. In other words, they just fall into your playing whenever you need them. Okay? So I've gotten 4 or 5 of these that I want to show you how just common ways that I've used them before. Okay? So this first one, just a single paradiddle. Single paradiddle is one of those magic rudiments. If somebody put a gun to your head and say, you can only do 3 rudiments the rest of your life, singles, doubles, and paradiddles is not a bad choice because they probably make up 99% or, well, we'll go down a little bit, 95% of everything we do on drum set, okay? Now, I like to use single paradiddles in 2 ways, okay? The first example that I'm going to show you is from a song that I used to play with this corporate band when I was in Atlanta. We used to do this song by Lionel Richie. It's called All Night Long. I don't know who the hack was that played on that track originally, but I guess he didn't hear. He's not coming out here. But there's an overdub that is in the verses, okay? And the overdub is a tom hit that's on the of 3. But now there's a bass drum on counts 2 and 4 and 16th notes on the hi-hat. So for those, again, your mathematical minds, you're going, does not compute. Because if you're going to play on the of 3, that's going to be your left hand. Wait a minute. How am I going to make that work, right? Here's how you make it work. You put a paradiddle starting on the of 2 to where your right hand is on count 3, then you have 2 lefts on the E and then your right hand is free to play the of 3. So this is the verse without the tom hit. And you got to have that of 3. Ba-doom, ba-doom. So this is the way I do it. I put that paradiddle in there. Slick, huh? Yeah. Again, you do this long enough, you don't even have to think about that. Now, the other thing that I like to do is I use a single paradiddle to turn around drum fills that are going to end on the wrong hand. Okay? And what I mean by that is, like, if we're doing a traditional around the kit kind of a drum fill, and it doesn't take you long when you've been doing this for a while to realize, oh my gosh, this drum fill is not going to end right, and I don't know what to do with my left hand because my crash is over here. Same thing. You can put a left-handed paradiddle in there that will end up turning your drum fill around. And the example I like to use is, like, for example, if you're playing a shuffle, and if you're playing a triplet drum fill that starts on count 2, you can put that left-handed paradiddle in at the end of the drum fill that turns it around to where your right hand can hit a crash. Let me do it super slow, and I'm just going to do the drum fill first. So it'd be like 1, 1, 2, 1. That's really handy, and like I said, you can use this on your drum fill of choice. But that's super handy, like I said, if you're playing a shuffle, if you have to start your drum fill, like if there's a figure that you have to hit on count 1, if you don't start your drum fill on count 1, you start it on count 2. Us righties are going to start it with the right hand. You're going to go around the kit, put that little slick paradiddle in, and live a happy life, right? And again, it's one of those things that when you do this for a little while, again, you get so familiar with these rudiments that you don't think about it. You literally just respond. You respond. You play the drum fill. That's not going to work out. Here we go. Bang. Okay? Double paradiddle. Double paradiddle, this is again, a little bit of a magic rudiment. I like this one a lot because essentially, if you're a person that plays some jazz, you're going to be called upon to play what we call like an Afro-Cuban 6/8. These double paradiddles, they just find their way into those grooves. I mean, you can literally construct an Afro-Cuban 6/8 with double paradiddles, okay? So let me demonstrate. First off, double paradiddle, right, left, right, left, right, right, then alternate it left, right, left, right, left, left, okay? So if you take that sticking, I'm going to play first just like the bell of this cymbal in a cross stick. Voice that around the kit a little bit. Add double paradiddle, makes its own Afro-Cuban, right? Double paradiddle. Let's keep going. Paradiddle diddle. Paradiddle diddle. This one is a good one. Again, here's more Smith proprietary pedagogy. I have a concept that I called active relaxation. Now, that's actually not proprietary. It's proprietary to drums, what I know of, but we use anybody who does yoga, they know what I'm talking about when I say active relaxation. For example, if you're doing vinyasa yoga, everybody can't wait to do downward facing dog, right? Because that's your active relaxation. That's a place you're actually working a little bit, but you're relaxing significantly more than when you're doing vinyasas. So for example, there are things that we have to play, styles, etc., that are very technically demanding. And whenever you work on these technically demanding things and you're playing them for extended periods of time, you need to be able to rest. Quick side note, let me tell you how I literally on the fly learned this. I had a very unique opportunity when I was in graduate school. I was at the University of Memphis. Memphis has a very little known history of being, everybody thinks of it as an R&B town and a blues town, which it is, don't get me wrong. You got Stax Records there, arguably the greatest R&B ever recorded. But a lot of people don't realize that it's got a very, very rich jazz heritage. Some of these masters that I can just name right off the top of your head, you'll go, they're from Memphis? Yeah. Phineas Newborn, James Williams, Donald Brown, Mulgrew Miller, George Coleman, who I'm talking about. So when I was in graduate school, I had the unique opportunity of being called upon to play with some of these giants when they would come through town. It was, shall we say, a learning experience. And I got to play with George Coleman. As a matter of fact, anybody who got to play with George Coleman, it's a learning experience because George Coleman is old school. He will throw the cymbal at you type kind of guy, right? And also, he's a little known fact about him. Everybody thinks of him as, and should be as a tenor sax player. That guy can play piano better than 99% of most piano players. So we were playing a gig, and he called Cherokee. So everybody knows Cherokee, right? Everybody knows that that's fast tune. He's playing it around probably 340, 360 beats per minute. Well, George has zero empathy for anybody. Not only does George play it at 360, but now this won't mean quite as much to the drummers here, but if you're a rhythm section player, this will make your eyes open up. George loves to do Cherokee in all 12 keys. He modulates each solo a half step. So you have to do, for when he plays saxophone and he does his solo, and you as the drummer are playing, you do that for all 12 keys for his saxophone solo before he goes and does all 12 keys on piano. Okay? So myself and this great bass player named Rodney Jordan, who teaches at Florida State and plays with Marcus Roberts, we were dying in front of a large group of people at there's a theater called the Omni New Daisy, and we were playing it in front of a lot of people, and he was killing us. He's like, I'm going to get these 22-year-olds, right? And so at that time, it's ride or die, right? So a paradiddle-diddle will be your right-hand savior on these up tempos. I'm going to demonstrate it for a second. And then also notice I put down here, double strokes also work real well. I kind of copped the double stroke thing from Max Roach. Max Roach a lot of times would play those crazy hard bop tempos, and then he would sometimes relax a little bit by playing doubles. So let me demonstrate both of them by themselves, and then I'm going to put them in context, okay? So first, here's a paradiddle-diddle. I'm going to play it on drum set, or on snare drum. Now I'm going to put one hand on a cymbal. Now, I'm going to play just doubles between the hands. Oh, thank you, Jeremiah. And it sounds like this. Now I'm going to put it into context, okay? So I'll play some up-tempo ride, then I'll relax for a little bit with some paradiddle-diddles, and also throw in some double strokes so you can hear what it sounds like, okay? Lifesavers. Okay? Lifesavers. Also, did you notice that when you do the paradiddle, it creates a nice polyrhythmic effect? Just a little extra added bonus there. 6-stroke roll. Anybody like Motown? The 6-stroke roll was Benny Benjamin's signature fill. You know this one? That's your 6-stroke. Great vocabulary, right? Great, just kind of improvisational vocabulary. The drag. The drag is one of, when I was in Memphis also, I got to work with Eddie Harris, okay, R.I.P. And Eddie Harris said something to me, you know, when you have a major figure turn around and say something to you, especially that's a profound thing, you remember it. And I remember him turning around to me. I was in a big band rehearsal with him. And he turns around and he goes like this. He goes, "Hey, man, play the ice cream scoop and you'll never be late on count 1. And I'm like, ice cream scoop, you know. And so, you know, I wasn't going to ask you for everybody what the ice cream scoop was. And so later I caught him off the side. I'm like, ice cream, man, I don't know what ice cream scoop is. He goes, man, just drag your hand into the downbeat. Right? So what he was saying is, it's a little timing mechanism is all it is. And it does add some texture, right, to what you're doing. But all he's saying is if you have to start time, you can just play a drag with your left hand. One, two, three, four. The ice cream scoop, right? Everybody knows what the ice cream scoop is. Yeah, now, okay. There's another thing that I like to do with drags that, again, it's just kind of this unintentional sort of like improvisatory vocabulary. Is anybody familiar with a great drummer named Carlos Vega? Yeah, JR and I actually were going to talk about him in a little while. He was not the first person or the only person to do what I'm going to show you, but he does it in such an incredibly slick way. And he was the drummer for James Taylor for quite a while. And there's a live James Taylor record that came out, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s. And they're doing that old Motown tune, How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You. And one of the slickest things, man, this is just, man, talk about L.A. slick. He would play a drag on the middle 2 16th notes of the triplet, especially like leading into like counts 2 or 4. In other words, not after the backbeat, leading into the backbeat or leading into a cymbal crash. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So using that tempo of like, you know, How Sweet It Is. Here it comes. Now, I'll tell you, if you want just insanely slick, is everybody familiar with Rod Morgenstein? Left-handed drummer, played with the Dregs, played with Steve Morse Band. If you want to get your face melted off, and I'll say the same thing with Billy Cobham also, check out Billy Cobham and Rod Morgenstein playing a ridiculous double bass shuffle. There's a song that the Steve Morse Band recorded back in 1984 called Cruise Missile. Oh, my God. Listen to Rod Morgenstein play at a breakneck tempo, that double bass shuffle, and putting those drags in between the grace notes. And then also listen to Billy Cobham off the Spectrum record. Same thing, that crazy double bass drum shuffle. I think it's on the tune Red Baron, where he's playing that double bass shuffle and putting those drags in between the double bass notes. Incredible. All right. Did everybody get their head full of interesting...